Good evening. Earth provides enough to satisfy every man's needs, but not every man's greed. These timeless words by Mahatma Gandhi remind us of the delicate balance between human ambition and environmental sustainability. As cultural catalyst, sustainability has long been one of the cornerstones of Avid Learning's programming. We remain committed to addressing the pressing needs for actionable steps to safeguard our planet's future by fostering critical conversations through book launches, thought leadership engagement, and multidisciplinary dialogues. This evening's program is a natural extension of this vision, bringing together literature, history, environmentalism to inspire meaningful change. My name is Asad Lalji. I'm the CEO of Avid Learning and the curator here at the Royal Opera House, Mumbai. On behalf of the royal family of Gondal, Ashish Doshi, Honorary Director, and myself, welcome to your city's very own crown jewel and India's only surviving opera house. Tonight feels special for many reasons. I believe that the fates of literature and our enduring partnerships have beautifully aligned to bring yet another literary giant to the Royal Opera House stage. Our partners this evening embody a shared mission to enrich the literary landscape of India and the world. Our collaboration with Literature Live began in 2010, and congratulations to the entire team on completion of their 15th very successful edition last month. And with HarperCollins, who we've had over a decade of partnerships with various book launches and events, our shared vision and dedication to fostering meaningful conversations make evenings like this possible. It is only fitting that the spotlight tonight is on historian and environmentalist Ramchandra Guha, whose work bridges the worlds of literature, history, and environmentalism with unparalleled depth and rigor. He has long been a leading force in documenting the India's story of environmental consciousness. And this brings me to the task at hand. On behalf of Avid Learning, HarperCollins India, Literature Live, and the Royal Opera House Mumbai, welcome to the Mumbai launch of Ramchandra Guha's new book, Speaking with Nature, The Origins of Indian Environmentalism. He will be in conversation with journalist and editor Supriya Nair. It is now my pleasure to welcome Artistic Director of QTP Entertainment and Co-Director of Literature Live, Kwasar Thakur Padamsi. Thank you very much for being here in such great numbers and braving the traffic in spite of the swearing in. But thank you and have a wonderful evening.
So everything Asad said, ditto. Just really quickly, thank you very much everyone for being here. It is really important that spaces like this are given for conversation and thought, and particularly in this age where we are at, where even the environment is a bad word. It's important that we have spaces like this to talk, and we have writers like this to write about the amazing things that are possible, and the long history that we have. So we're very thankful on behalf of Literature Live. We're very thankful for the partnership with the Royal Opera House and Avid Learning, and of course to HarperCollins for making this happen. And thank you all for braving the mad traffic for the swearing in. So I'm not going to take too much time because I know we are having a slightly delayed start. But I'd like to invite on stage Akriti Tyagi, who is the Marketing and Communications Director of HarperCollins India.
Thanks, Kwasar. Good evening. It is a privilege to welcome you all to the launch of Speaking with Nature, a landmark work by Dr. Ramchandra Guha that reshapes our understanding of environmentalism and its deeply rooted connections to India. For too long, the narrative has been that nations like ours, with their myriad challenges of development, cannot afford the luxury of environmental consciousness. But as this remarkable book reveals, India has long been home to visionary thinkers and activists who anticipated the global environmental movement, offering insights that resonate powerfully even today. Speaking with Nature introduces us to 10 extraordinary individual voices who articulated the perils of environmental degradation and advocated for harmony with nature, not as an abstract ideal, but as a necessity for human survival. Tonight, we celebrate this vital contribution to environmental thought, and we look forward to a lively and thought-provoking discussion. Dr. Ramchandra Guha is a renowned historian and author whose works, including The Unquiet Woods, India After Gandhi, and a 2-volume biography of Mahatma Gandhi, have been translated into over 20 languages and recognized globally. He has taught at esteemed institutions like Stanford, LSE, and most recently at Kriya University. As a distinguished university professor, Dr. Guha has recently received numerous prestigious awards, including the Sahitya Academy Award, the Fukuoka Prize, and an honorary doctorate from Yale University for his exceptional contributions to history and environmental studies. He will be in conversation with Supriya Nair. Supriya is head of research and media at the Godrej DEI Lab. She is a journalist and editor who co-founded the publication 52 and a former books consultant and columnist for Mumbai Mirror. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and Vogue. On behalf of HarperCollins, I also take this opportunity to thank and show my sincere gratitude to Amy Fernandez and Kwasar Thakur Padamse, co-directors at Literature Live, and Asad Lalji, SVP SR Group, CEO of Avid Learning and curator, Royal Opera House, Bombay, for their continued support and partnership. And thank you all for being a part of this significant occasion. May I please now call upon the stage Dr. Ramchandra Guha, Supriya Nair, Asad Lalji, Amy Fernandez, and Kwasar to please help us unveil the book.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who helped put this evening together. I've spent so many happy evenings at the Royal Opera House, always in the nosebleed seats, listening to great performances. So it's quite exciting to be here, and always very exciting to be here with you, Ram. How are you?
Well enough.
Good to hear.
Having listened to a little bit of Sharafat Hussain Khan in the afternoon.
Before you came here.
Before I came here.
Thank you for writing this book. Personally, for me, I felt emotionally attached to it before it ever came out, because a few years ago, when you and I were talking at Koshi's, when we met in Bangalore, you had mentioned you hadn't, the second Gandhi book hadn't been out yet, and you'd mentioned that there was this cupboard at home that was full of your notes about a history of Indian environmentalism, and I felt then that I desperately wanted to read it, and you said, and I think it's okay now to say it because it would have been quite melancholy if things had been different. You'd said then, well, I don't know if I'll ever get to it. I have a lot.
I remember that, yeah.
Yes, I have a lot to do. So thank you. It's been a true pleasure reading the book, and perhaps actually, let me be honest. It's been even more of a pleasure to revisit, and in some cases read for the first time some of your other work on environmentalism, on the Indian environment. You've been a great friend and fellow traveler to great intellectuals who have worked on this. And so getting some sense of this network and the things that you all have thought about and fought about and written about has been a wonderful education for me. You were a young scholar of the environment and environmental movements in the 1980s. And you brought out your first book in that decade. And I know that it was an urgent decade for environmental crises. You must have heard a lot about deforestation and overpopulation and things like that. But I bet that your peers weren't talking about whether or not to have children because they didn't know what the future would hold. And my peers are, and people younger than us definitely are. So my first question to you is what it's like to return to writing and publishing about ecological matters in this moment of crisis.
Well, thank you, Supriya. Thank you first of all for agreeing to be here today. I remember that conversation well, and when I said I don't think I'll ever write this book. And that book was, before I answer your question, I'll just say a little bit about why I thought of the book that has just come out. I had spent a decade and a half writing about contemporary environmental movements in India and the world. And I got interested in the early history of environmental thought and was collecting material on some pioneering environmental writers of the 20s and 30s who did not call themselves environmental writers. They were activists, Gandhians, sociologists, town planners, but the language they used was, for me, recognizably environmental and prophetic and prescient about where India was in the 80s and 90s. And I saw it as a kind of complement to the work I'd done. So it would have been environmentalism from above, intellectual history of environmentalism, counterposed to grassroots, peasant-based activist environmentalism. Right. And then I set it aside, and then I came back, as you say, kind of in the time of climate change. And I almost called this book, the book is called Speaking with Nature. The working title was Environmentalism Before Climate Change. And for various reasons, I dropped that. I thought it would be rather instrumental.
Provocative.
And also instrumental to use climate change, because this is really a book about beyond climate change. It essentially argues that even before climate change took place, there were multiple environmental issues. There were questions raised about India's path of economic, urban, technological development. So and which persist even today. I mean, one of the arguments of the book is that even if climate change did not exist, India would be an environmental disaster zone. But it's true. It's kind of come at a time when, as you say, because of the urgent threat of climate change, I mean, we've just seen a terrible cyclone along the Coromandel coast, many people are waking up to it. But in a sense, what this book is arguing is that there was environmentalism before climate change, and they are environmental concerns which should attend to and which profoundly affect human lives and livelihoods independent of climate change. So one of the problems...
Sorry, just so for my understanding, the independent of the kind of very specific problems related to global warming and...
exactly, and the unpredictable weather events.
Growth,
and
yes.
the unpredictable weather events.
Right.
But they're kind of connected. I mean,
yes.
Global warming is connected to a certain pattern of consumption, production, distribution. The idea that there's an unending frontier where you can have economic growth forever. Everyone can, every Indian can live the life of a rich American, and every Indian can live the life of a rich Mumbaiker, which is, in my view, physically and materially impossible. Forget the ethics of it. I'm not speaking here as a biographer of Gandhi. I'm not advocating abstinence and, simplicity. I'm just saying the world does not have enough to sustain, the global replication of American standards of consumption. And Indians and Chinese, and indeed Americans who think that this is possible, are deceiving themselves. This chimera, this dream has led in part to climate change. But if you look at India today, so air pollution in northern India, which we talk about in October and November generally, and which affects particularly the poor and the vulnerable who do not have air purifiers. This air pollution, which damages health, impairs livelihood, stops children going from school, has nothing to do with climate change. The death of our rivers has nothing to do with climate change. The depletion of groundwater aquifers, which have made lands arid and threaten even farming prospects in places like Punjab, has nothing to do with climate change. The chemical contamination of the soil has nothing to do with climate change. The loss of biodiversity, the invasion of some of our best forests by invasive exotic weeds from other parts of the world is independent of climate change. All of this is affecting hundreds of millions of people. And of course, this book is about writers and thinkers writing and thinking and arguing long before climate change was even conceived of. But one of the things I hope to do, apart from drawing attention to these thinkers and their ideas and their arguments and their perceptions, is to tell the younger environmentalists of today, it is not only about climate change. Yes, climate change is real, but the problem is much deeper, much more diverse, and actually climate change is only one part of it.
Right, that it's kind of fundamentally, there is a fundamentally networked issue here, and that many of the things that you talk about were on the minds of many of the thinkers in this book, and possibly many others in kind of the broader history of writing about environment. I think I can imagine that people already are wondering if this is a work of Gandhian scholarship in some way.
Well, there's no chapter on Gandhi.
There isn't.
epigraph from Gandhi, which says that India will strip the world like bear like locusts if it emulates
a country of 300 million.
Yeah, 300 million, which is now it's of course
that's right.
1.5 billion, and if you take India and China together, we may strip the world bare like locusts. Gandhi is a presence. There are two followers of Gandhi, Miraben and J.C. Kubarappa, who are profiled in this book. There are other people who knew Gandhi. I mean, the book starts with Tagore and argues that he was a multi-dimensional environmentalist, educational, prophetic, and there's a picture of Tagore and Gandhi in their last meeting in Shantiniketan on the cover. But he's a kind of absent presence, you could say. But there's also a critique of Gandhi in that the Gandhian heritage in the environmental movement of the 70s and 80s was very strong and very visible, Supriya.
Yes.
The best known environmentalists of the time, grassroots environmentalists, who articulated what I have called in my earlier work an environmentalism of the poor, an environmentalism concerned with sustainable livelihoods, not with beautiful landscapes, or not merely with beautiful landscapes. This was deeply inspired by Gandhi in their forms of protest, in their efforts at ecological reconstruction, if you think of the Chipko movement, the Narmada movement. So Gandhi was always there, was a very important and largely positive influence on the Indian environmentalism of the 70s and 80s and 90s.
Right.
But there was also a negative dimension to it, which is Gandhi, like Gandhi, Gandhian environmentalists turned their back on the city.
That's right.
Okay, and this book has, Gandhi famously said, India lives in her villages, which it does, but it also lives in her cities.
Increasingly more than ever, yes.
Increasingly more than ever, exactly. And one of the people in this book, in fact, some ways, a character I was very happy to bring back into the broader discussion was the Scotsman Patrick Geddes, whom, of course, town planners know about, but whose work and Scottish environmentalists know about, but whose work on environmental town planning in India, when he lived here for a decade, from 1915 to 1924, part of the time in this city as the first professor of sociology in Bombay University. Yes. So in that decade, the plans he wrote, and if I may, share a story about Geddes.
Yeah.
So Geddes was born in 1854 on, excuse me, on 2nd October, so the same day, 15 years before Gandhi. He trained with T.H. Huxley, the great evolutionist. He got interested in, he was inspired by William Morris, the great crafts person in England, and then he became a town planner in Scotland, and spent his life writing about the rise, growth, and possible decay of European cities and the environmental and social constraints they faced. And he had this exhibition called Cities in History, which he was bringing to India to show in Indian cities in 1914, when he was already 60. Yes. And he takes a ship from the UK to Madras, because it was going to begin in Madras. Yeah. And
the exhibition takes another ship, right?
Exhibition takes another ship, and a German submarine, because the First World War had broken out, sinks it. And here, it's a great lesson for all the senior citizens in this room, including myself. Here's a person who's 60. His life's work has gone into the bottom of the ocean. The life's work he was going to show in all our cities, it doesn't matter. I'll study Indian cities instead. And he spends the next decade writing a series of town plans which are buried in old libraries, out of print. And Geddes is someone who, in a sense, is is bringing the urban perspective to environmentalism long before, in an absolutely prescient way, 100 years ago.
Right, and not just big cities like Madras and Bombay. He gets invited to small towns that are the capitals of princely states and writes reports that you perhaps, I think, rightly diagnose as never having been read by the Maharajas who commissioned them.
That's right, yeah.
Also, I have to say this for those of you who are about to look up Patrick Geddes on your phones. He's always struck me as an unkempt Scottish version of Pankaj Mishra to look at. Which
longer beard.
Yes.
I would amend that, if I meant. Unkempt Scottish version of Rabindranath Tagore. I think that's more appropriate.
We'll make sure that Pankaj hears about the...
By the way, he knew Tagore, and one of his great disappointments in the decade he spent in India was that Tagore did not allow him to redesign Shantiniketan.
Because Tagore had a hand in designing Shantiniketan himself.
Exactly,
And so he was,
precisely.
Right, right.
He was a control freak of a certain kind.
Yes,
About that,
very
yeah.
difficult to budge. Did Geddes have something to say? I mean, let's spend some time on Geddes. Did he have something to say about Bombay that you might perhaps want to tell a story about? That?
Well, he wrote on Thane, a small report on Thane. He taught students sociology and civics in Bombay University. So I think the Bombay School of Economics, Sociology, which is still thriving and produced lots of good scholars. In fact, one of them, Indira Munshi, has written a fine book on Geddes, which I've quoted in my book. But his big plans were on Indore, because he believed, this is interesting, he believed that the cities of the future had to be medium size. Bombay was too big. Yeah. London was too big. New York was too big. So even Edinburgh was too big. So Dundee rather than Edinburgh, Indore rather than Bombay. You know, which is a very interesting way of conceiving how urban development should take place, you know, on the human scale. So he left, of course, a legacy through his students. There is again someone who has discovered letters of Geddes in the Maharashtra archives. An interesting American who lives in India called Robert Stevens, who's an architect some of you might know, and hopefully he'll write something on Geddes' years in Bombay. But most of his plans were about, as you said, smaller towns, you know, sometimes princely states, but he wrote a very interesting report called a report on 6 towns in the Bombay presidency. So one was on Thane, one was on Nadiad, one was on Bharuch, and I think that's a really interesting model for us to follow. You know, like, maybe I shouldn't be saying it on a day like this, but one of the mistakes that the state of Maharashtra made was to make Mumbai the capital. Yes, one of the mistakes that my home state, Karnataka, made was to make Bangalore the capital. Because if you make a large commercial city also the political capital, you know, rather than having dispersed urbanization, which leads to balanced regional development, you know, one of the sensible things that your putative home state, I don't know, do you claim it as your home state, Kerala?
My grandmotherland.
Or your grandmotherland did, was to separate the political capital, Trivandrum, from the commercial capital, Kochi. Yes. So I think Geddes is, I mean, Geddes, of course, Bombay University in 1924 was a great place, and he occupied the first professorship in sociology anywhere, you know, which is an extraordinary tribute to the Mumbai of that time, that they could have a Scotsman as their first professor of sociology. I don't think it would be conceivable now to have a Scotsman as a professor of sociology in this or any other city in India. But I think he coined the terms megalopolis, conurbation, and these are terms of description, but not of approval, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. How fascinating that he wanted to lay out Shantiniketan all over again. And I'll move from the Geddes-Tagore axis, not to Gandhi, but actually to the first page of your book, your dedication. It's dedicated to a scholar whom we'll return to perhaps later, whom you describe as a fellow traveler from red to green. And I think your Gandhian scholarship is inextricable from this. But I'd love to know more about that journey.
Well, yeah. I mean, so I think the person Supriya mentioned is one of the 2 dedicators to the book. So he's 20 years older than me. The other dedicatee is my daughter, because I wanted a generation above and a generation below. He's alive. He's 87. 86, he's just published a wonderful book, it's called Land, Water, Air, Freedom, A History of Environmental Justice. He lives in Barcelona.
Let me pronounce his name so that you can correct me. Is it Juan Martinez Ayer?
Yeah, so actually, he started life as Joan Martinez Ayer because he was born in Franco, Spain. Yes. Later on, he became a Catalan nationalist. So he's now Juan Martinez Ayer, and he used to be J-U-A-N, and now he's J-O-A-N, like Miro, like the artist. Yes. But he's one of the scholars who's profoundly influenced me in blending sociological and economic analysis and historical analysis with environmental understanding. So he's what you may call a social ecologist. But also Marxism, he started as a Marxist. And he was so did I.
As you did yourself.
So did I,
yes.
And he was a Marxist much longer than me. And when we first met in Kolkata.
Hard not to be when you're born in Franco, Spain, I guess.
Exactly,
Yeah.
precisely. And he was in exile in Europe. He only went back after Franco fell and democracy came. And his first books were published in emigre editions in Paris. But when we first met in 1988 in Bangalore, he was 50, I was 30. And he just, at our first meeting, he described himself as a lapsed Marxist. So like a lapsed Catholic. Now, and I think it's a beautiful description. Because he didn't say a Marxist has become anti-Marxist. He still retained some critical elements of the Marxist analytical framework. But the reason he went away from Marxism was Marxism in the 1980s and the 1970s. They detested environmentalists. When I started my research in Kolkata in 1981, with the CPM in power, and every intellectual, including my teachers and guides, to the left of the CPM. I said, I want to work on the Chipko movement. They say, but environmentalism is a bourgeois deviation from the class struggle. And then they said, the Chipko movement is anti-revolutionary. They said, what do you mean? He said, they are peasants wanting to protect the trees from being felled. I said, yes, they want to protect the trees from being felled because those trees nurture them, they give them fuel, fodder, pasture. They also protect the soil so that there's no soil erosion and floods. They said, no, but they are objectively counter-revolutionary because when the trees are felled, they go to the paper and plywood factory where the proletariat led by the revolutionary party will bring about a revolution in India. Now, that was Marxism. Yes. And so Juan lapsed before me, or in a more interesting way than me. And also he's got the most delightful sense of humor. My wife Sudhata is here, who's here in the audience will remember. We took a trip with him to show him Halibut, Belur, and Shravan Belagola. And he was 30 years older, but climbing all those mountains much quicker. And he had just a delightful, mischievous sense of humor. And having friends like him, who are older than me, and people like my daughter who are younger than me, keeping me in check, inspiration and, how do I put it, a check on hubris, perhaps, I think it's so, so that friendship has meant intellectually and personally, I think, and again, it's a sign, I'm digressing a bit, Supriya, but I think you'll allow me. It's a sign of the great leaders of our past, and the great people of the past, that there are friendships across religions, nationalities, genders. I wonder if the people in power in India today ever speak to someone who's not like them. They normally speak down, but that's a different question. But I think a friendship, and normally, I think I was doubled to know Juan, who used to be Juan, has been such a deep sense of enrichment in my life, because if Indians make foreign friends, they're usually in the Anglophone world.
That's right.
Yeah, so to meet a Spaniard Catalan, whose second book was on Peru and whose third book was on Cuba, and who has traveled to more parts of India than I have. In his 70s, he was going through Orissa, studying the impact of mining on Adivasi communities. So I think I actually, since we started with my telling you that I had this book to write and I thought I would never write it, I wanted it published while Juan was still there. So I'm glad I was able to do that.
Congratulations on that.
Because he's now 87.
Yeah, and Ram, I completely understand that things like these can feel like achievements in a way that an award or a fellowship possibly couldn't. So I'm very happy, not only for myself, but also for you, that
because of him.
the book arrived when it did.
So thank you for raising him. He's been a profoundly humanizing influence on me.
But, and this speaks to the quality and the generosity of your scholarship as well, learning not only about him. I've read the essay that you contributed to his Festschrift, but there's also, so much of your more public work. You've written with Madhav Gadgil, whom many Bombayites are hopefully familiar with and whose work they love, with Shekhar Pathak, whose oral history of the Chipko movement you edited in translation from the Hindi, and you contributed a lovely preface, a lovely introduction to it. It drew, so this book and then your other work kind of drew me into this network of intellectual comrades that I've really enjoyed learning about and look forward to learning more about. And I feel like all of this helps me create a kind of fuzzy picture of your own intellectual journey on that red to green spectrum. Would it be wrong for me to say that you became it is your environmentalism that led you into your study of Gandhi?
Yes, partly. I would say
So not directly, certainly.
No. I think partly, even quite substantially.
Right.
But along with the environmentalism, so there were, I would say, three components. One was the environmentalism, my work on Chipko, and the Chipko activists I met in the field,
Yes.
whose life and commitment to the dispossessed was in such contrast to the Marxist intellectuals in Calcutta who were my teachers who disparaged the Gandhians. And so that was one. The second thing was that I was, as you know, fascinated for many years by very relevant, the maverick British anthropologist who became an
Yes.
Indian and knew Gandhi and admired Gandhi but fought with Gandhi.
Yes.
So
about whom your biography, Savaging the Civilized, was perhaps the earliest work of biography you published?
that's it, absolutely.
Right.
But the third thing, and it's appropriate I mention it in Mumbai, which drew me to Gandhi. So there was environmentalism, there was this maverick Englishman who was inspired by Gandhi, but also pissed off by Gandhi telling him to be celibate after marriage. Gandhi's ideas about prohibition, but he had a kind of an intense love-hate relationship, father-son thing with Gandhi. But the third thing, which I'd like to say, which drew me to Gandhi since you asked this question, which is linked to this city, is the book I know you have said nice things about elsewhere, A Corner of a Foreign Field.
Yes.
This is my history of cricket in Mumbai.
Yeah.
Social history of cricket in Mumbai, whose great hero are a family of Dalit brothers, the Palwankar brothers, Balu, Vittal, Ganpat, and Shivaram. So when I finished that book and the proofs came, I started compiling the index making the index. Now, earlier today we were discussing that Gandhi hardly saw any films in his life, possibly two, maybe half of one in the Opera House. We don't know for sure.
We don't know.
We don't know for sure. But we do know for sure that Gandhi had a magisterial disregard, not a hatred, not a contempt, but a disregard, which is worse. A magisterial disregard for film and cricket are two great passions.
Right.
And I wrote this social history of cricket. The proofs came. And I was compiling the proofs. And there was C.K. Naidu and Vijay Merchant and Palwankar Balu and Vasant Raiji and D.R. Jardine and Lord Hawke. And then Gandhi kept on appearing. That in a book on the social history of cricket in Mumbai, there were 33 index references to Gandhi because the bloody fellow was everywhere, even if he never watched a cricket match. Right. So I said, look, I have to settle my accounts with Gandhi. He's there. Wherever I go, he's following me. Environmentalism, tribal. So all of this kind of said, I have to chase
This
him
is the
directly.
direction I
chase
go,
him directly,
from red to green to Gandhi.
Yeah, so certainly the environmentalism and meeting people like, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, Radha Bhatt, who is an extraordinary female activist.
Leaders of the Chipko movement.
Who's
Yes.
still alive in Kausani. If anyone ever gets to Kausani, which has the most beautiful views of the snows, almost anywhere in the Garhwal Himalaya, there's a remarkable lady called Radha Bhatt, who is now 89, who ran for many years an extraordinary ashram called Lakshmi Ashram, working on women's education and emancipation. She was also later head of the Gandhi Peace Foundation. So just meeting her, and again, this is someone who, like Gandhi, had a sense of humor, who could laugh at us, has a sense of humor. So, yeah, I would say that was part of it. But finding that even in a book on cricket, Gandhi cast his shadow, influenced how people thought, talked, argued about it. That Palwankar Balu, the Dalit cricketer, and his brother Vittal, got some of the honor and respect they deserved because of Gandhi's campaign against untouchability. So I think all of this, yeah.
Right. And that filter, certainly you, as you say, I don't know if absent presence is how I would describe him, but he shadows the book.
Yes,
Certainly
this book,
directly in when you write about the work of the economist J.C. Kumarappa, of the social activist Meera Behen, Madeline Slade, who was also a concert pianist.
Yeah.
Right, which I discovered.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
We were discussing this, we were discussing music earlier today. So quite directly over there, and then sort of walking beside, I suppose, everyone from Tagore to many of the other thinkers over here. And the thing about Gandhian thought is that rarely is it assessed in terms of dogma, the way Marxism is. And in the work of these people, you can truly see how it could be holistic and encompass many things, perhaps not the city and not the cinema, but it could encompass many things and filter into how Gandhi's followers saw the web of life and human interconnectedness with nature, and the deep compassion that required for us to understand and be humbled by and serve, without it directly leading to, big picture ideas about Gandhi the ecologist. So that was very good. I would, if we have time, perhaps like to come back and spend a little more time on Kumarappa or Meera Behan, but I also don't want to, I don't want to make this a military march through each of the thinkers in the book. There is one, though, whom it would be lovely for you to introduce to the audience, because she's introduced, I think, to almost every reader of the book for the first time through your own work. And this is Gabriel Howard, whom you write about in a chapter along with her husband, Albert Howard. Sorry, yes.
Yeah,
please.
so actually in some ways, Supriya, that was the most difficult of the chapters to write.
You recovered a lot of her work.
But it was the most difficult chapter to write because, as I said, Gandhi said India lives in villages. And I'm an entirely urban person who's never lived in a village. I mean, I've written about forests, I've written about...
I guess Dehradun was a small town.
I've written a small town.
Right,
I grew up in Dehradun, a small town. And maybe that's why I prefer small towns to large megalopolises.
Geddes-like.
Yeah. So, but, to write about agriculture, so I just briefly rehearse the biographical facts. Albert Howard is recognized globally as if not the pioneer of organic agriculture, the first major critic of chemicalized agriculture. His book, An Agricultural Testament, is still read all over the world, and it's a kind of a Bible for organic farmers. And I knew about him a little bit, not much. He studied in Cambridge, he was an Englishman, came to England, joined what was then the Imperial Agricultural Research Institute in Pusa, worked there before, and then shortly after he joined, before he came out, he had fallen in love with a younger Cambridge colleague called Gabriel, who also studied botany and agriculture, and they got married. And then they stayed in India for almost 30 years, first in the colonial system, then in the princely state of Indore, which is where they perfected their methods of composting as an alternative to chemical agriculture. And while Albert Howard was much better known, Gabriel fell through the cracks because she died in 1930. And Howard lived another 20 years. And his major books were published after that. Now, interestingly, after his wife, Gabriel, died, they had no children, he married Gabriel's sister, who then wrote a book about...
Classically Indian, if you ask me.
Maybe. And she was devoted to the husband and wrote this. And then I found that actually her contributions were immense. And when she was in Cambridge, there was a famous physicist called Blackwood, a chemist to whose work she contributed. And the credit went to, as it often does, it often does in science, even today, that the students publishes a paper with the supervisor, and the supervisor's name comes first. And in her case, she was a woman, so it was even, more, how do I say, customary to suppress her contributions. But clearly, she was of uncommon brilliance and originality, which her husband recognized. So reading her husband's writings against the grain, she just kept a few papers of hers, which I was able to find. The presidential address to the Indian Science Congress's section on botany. She was the first woman of any kind to be president of a section in the Indian Science Congress. Then a long 60-page paper she wrote on wheat growing in what is now the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, hotbed of terrorism. I mean, she must have been the first European woman ever to go there, and certainly the first scientist, female scientist. And so, and she had actually, you used the word holistic earlier on in this conversation. She had a much more ecological, holistic approach to agricultural science of looking at things differently, not just looking at the top of the plant and the bottom of the plant, not looking at the soil separately and the water separately. And she actually was a kind of forged an ecological understanding of agriculture, which her husband took forward. And perhaps he was, a better researcher. Of course, he lived longer. As a man, it was easier for him to work with Indian peasants, and I have reciprocal learning from them. But at the first, so I think it was just serendipity. I knew about Albert Howard, and then I found that his wife Gabriel was an extraordinary figure in her own right, and intellectually probably more original than her husband, which he, to his credit, if you read his writings, recognizes. And says he left an unfinished book, and, but here are some fragments from the notes which I've quoted, which are strikingly original. So,
Thank you. As with so many of your works, many readers and hopefully, and I know many scholars will think about, will think of it as a springboard from which to examine new fields of inquiry, write new books. If I have one wish for this, it's that this beautiful act of recovery of Gabriel Howard's scholarship will inspire more scholars to recover other hidden women in the archives, writing about the environment, writing about the climate and ecology. I couldn't think of a more beautiful sort of feminist task. Okay, I did say that we won't go person by person, right? Yeah. So let me go back then to another of your earlier books and draw a connection between that and this one. When you wrote Environmentalism, A Global History, which I revisited and loved. The very matter-of-fact ambition of that book floored me. And I know that you probably get asked about Corner of a Foreign Field all the time. And this book made me wonder, maybe more people should be out there, asking you to sign copies of Environmentalism, A Global History. Because to me, it's just as vibrant, and its arguments are lovely. You constructed that in a fairly, it proceeds along expected thematic lines. You tell us about the first wave, the second wave, it's organized by argument. And then you write this one as an intellectual history. Should we talk a little bit more perhaps about moving from one structure to the other and why this one appealed to you over here?
Yeah, actually, yes. I mean, you're right, that was much more thematic.
Yes.
And it's a global history, this is an Indian history. At one stage, that book was written partly because I was fortunate enough to, after my PhD, to spend some time in America and a little later in Germany to have access to the kind of archives and libraries I would not have here, to write about Brazil and Kenya and America and Europe and Australia. Yes. But it is organized thematically, and that's partly because, Supriya, I mean, people recognize me as a historian. But my degree is actually in economics and sociology. I came to history later. Yes. And in a sense, sociologists are more interested in structure and process than narrative. And they're more interested in things like sociological phenomenon, like the impact of class relations, the role of the state, the role of technology, than in individual human beings. And over the course of my career, I suppose I'm still a little bit of a sociologist. I'm a lab sociologist, I haven't rejected sociology. But I moved more towards narrative and biography in individuals. Yes. I actually thought, and this is a book about 10 individuals, yes. I actually thought about, should I recast it thematically, using categories that are what I call socio-ecological. So I went for a long time going back and forth. The research had been done. Yes. So I had the material.
Yeah, it was in the cupboard.
And I then did a little more after the pandemic and fleshed out. But I thought, should I do it the way I've done it, which is start chronological. So it starts with Tagore, then Radhakamala Mukherjee, economist, and then
and historically terrible writer.
Terrible, yes. Terrible. And then Kumarappa, the economist. Then it has 5, so it starts with 3 Indians, then it has 5 non-Indians who worked here, including Geddes and the Howards and Miraben, and then it ends with 2 Indians again, Munshi and Krishnan. Yeah. Now, I thought, should I do it? After long, I would almost consider doing it thematically by what I call socio-ecological spaces. So I started with the wild, then I would come to the forest, which is not really the wild, but has elements of human beings. Yes. Then I would have come to the farm, and the village, and the city. So in a sense, all those categories are covered in the book in different ways. Yes. But I thought if I do that, only my fellow sociologists will read it. Possibly.
Right, and many of us, but I take your
But I still feel maybe that could have been a different way of slicing this. To look at it and then the region also. So like Mukherjee is a regionalist. And so is Geddes. So they're looking at the forest, the farm, and the city in the region. So, it could be the Sahyadris, it could be the Konkan, it could be the Western Ghats, it could be the Himalaya.
Yeah.
So I think these are other ways in which one can write narratives.
Right, and you don't need you don't need like kind of rhyme and rhythm thematically for the book to resound with some of your earlier work. You do open environmentalism by writing about the work of William Morris, whom you just talked about, and John Ruskin, the art critic.
Yeah.
These people who are so alive to beauty, and that kind of brings them, these arc Victorianists, into conversation with nature. Wordsworth, of course, and the Romantic movement. And I remember, kind of reading your Tagore chapter and thinking, oh, is Ram going to reference Blake and the Dark Satanic Mills? But you don't here, and then you do over there. But you open this with Tagore as well, right? And that made me think, okay, this is a good time to ask Ram about just your own, to engage you a bit on your own love of literature, And I think the fact that there's something quite lovely and romantic about the fact that you open both books with thinkers who kind of laid the imaginative bases for environmentalism.
I think that's because they understood it much. Being poets, they understood it much before anyone else. They understood the gravity of what was going on well before scientists and particularly economists.
Yes.
Who are always last
certainly.
to understanding serious issues. Right? Okay.
Yeah, no argument from me.
Okay. So I think that's what it is. I mean, so Tagore comes to it, and the Tagore chapter argues that his environmentalism was aesthetic, it was educational, it was political, and it was also prophetic. So so was, and in some ways, I don't reference Blake, but I think I reference Morris. So it is because Morris also had a kind of political...
And Blake in the earlier book.
In the earlier book, yeah. So I think poets... I think it was Shelley who famously said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. I wish they were, but they are, sadly no one. Yes. No. But I think they have that instinct of seeing things that are really significant and important. Especially, some of the darker sides of human life and existence, not just the joyous sides.
Are you a lover of poetry yourself?
No, I actually don't read much poetry.
That wasn't
I read much
way
more
into
fiction.
this.
No, I just need more. I'm just sort of thinking aloud of your question, because I didn't think of it when I started that book with Wordsworth and this book with Tagore. I mean, it's a very interesting observation. I was thinking that maybe it's just that they see it before the scientists and the economists.
Yeah, and you have to imagine something before the theory comes alive.
And Wordsworth and Tagore, just anecdotally, were both travelers. They were not poets in the forest, or just in the forest, or just in the study. They were traveling around and going, meeting people, and so they had a connection with everyday life.
Yes, absolutely. And through fiction and poetry, this does show up over and over again, right? So fans of The Lord of the Rings may possibly know that J.R.R. Tolkien, long after he fell out of fashion and became kind of slightly musty, I mean, he's, of course, always rediscovered every couple of generations, he was still beloved for his view of, the primacy of nature and of trees and the forest being as important as the other beings in his fantasy universe. So perhaps there is a history of environmentalism and love for a future of environmentalism that is imagined through fiction and poetry.
I think that it would be a great book if someone wants to write that.
Yeah, it would be lovely to think about how that has
so my work is mostly
Indeed,
uses
you're right.
The genres of non-fiction.
And there's so much we don't know about how this has shown up in Indian literature, right?
There would be elements.
Yeah,
my friends of mine who read Kannada tell me about Kuvempu, K.B. Puttappa, who wrote about peasants and forests in a very interesting way. I mean, the Malayalam poet Sugata Kumari, I don't read these languages, but and certainly, so I think there's a kind of this is a book of sort of sociological thinkers. Even the chapter on Tagore is mostly about his essays and polemical tracts, and there's just a few excerpts from his
It is about his, that's right.
So I think they, and there's a field now what they call eco-criticism, which could look at Indian literature in different languages and its relationship with the environment.
If there's someone in the audience.
I'm sure there are young people working on it. I have no doubt that there's several PhDs being written as we speak. Yeah. I look forward to that.
We'd love to know. Yeah. Okay, let me take you geographically back to Dehradun and the Himalayas. in your introduction to Shekhar Pathak's book on the Chipko movement, you have this lovely story, about you're in Dehradun, I think, and you call him from a phone booth and you say,
I'm in Mussoorie.
You're in Mussoorie, and you call him and you say, "मैं अपने प्रदेश में आया हूँ," meaning I've
बोल
come
रहा
to
हूँ, से
our,
बोल रहा हूँ.
हाँ, I've come to our part of the world, and then you have a moment where you pull back and you think, do I really have a claim to use the word apna? But you grew up in the hills, and I wonder what your relationship with it continues to be.
So, Martha Gellhorn, the great writer, the Gabriel Howard of the Marriage with Hemingway, so a great writer whom people only know as
That is entirely
Hemingway's
to
wife.
Hemingway's credit.
Yes. So she once said, one should never go back to the places one loved as a child or as a young person. Now, I do occasionally go back to Dehradun, but the more I go back, and it's not only because of, the environmental destruction, it's because of the terrible religious majoritarianism. I mean, Uttarakhand never knew persecution of minorities till the last decade, more or less. But I do have attachments. Shekhar Pathak, whom you mentioned, the great historian of Uttarakhand.
Would you like to give the audience a brief introduction?
So Shekhar Pathak is,
your brother.
He's my brother.
Yeah.
I mean, and our upbringings could not be very different. Doon School and St. Stephen's College, son and grandson of PhDs. That's me. Shekhar Pathak, born in a village. His father, a sepoy in the army, studied in the village school in Ganguli Hat and then in Almora. And we met, both of us did research on the history of peasant movements in Uttarakhand. And everywhere I went, they said, "Tumko Shekhar se milna hai."
Because every document you checked out, you were the second, and Shekhar was the first.
So I go to Nainital, exactly a little more than 40 years ago, 83 probably. And I, meet this person who's teaching in Nainital University. He's with students, and he says, "Tum baad mein aao, ye bahut dur se aaye hain. Hamare mehman hain." And we just chat, and our conversation has continued ever since. About history, about culture, about ecology. Those of you who have an adequate knowledge of Hindi, and I'm sure that is a majority of the audience, not a scholar's knowledge, an adequate knowledge. Just Google Shekhar Pathak Himalaya. On YouTube, you will find talks of his that are extraordinarily rich, learned, humorous, illuminating, self-deprecatory. He is one of the most remarkable human beings I've ever met, and I've met plenty of those. And he has traveled in virtually every valley of Uttarakhand, Garhwal, Kumaon. He has been many times to Ladakh, to Arunachal, for parikramas to Kailash. And he gives these slideshows where he will take you through the different dimensions from the plains up to the highest mountains. At every village he will tell you, ye yahan se hain. Bachendri Pal, the first woman to climb Everest, was from there. That has this rare orchid. That is where the third Chipko movement took place. And just please go to his, just try and locate his talks. So again, like Juan Martinez Alier, who is, my closest non-Indian friend, here is an Indian friend and intellectual comrade and teacher and companion of a very different background, but with a shared love of scholarship, obscure archival sources. I dedicated a corner of the foreign field to him. And he said, he doesn't talk about cricket, but Corner of Foreign Field is based on fugitive newspaper archives, and it's inspired by the kind of his search for documents all over the Himalaya. And I remember he said, he was very angry with me. He said, "Tumhari kitab aayi, your book has come." Or his son picked it up, and he said, opened it. He said, "Baba, ye Ram Kaka ne kitab likhi hai, tumhare liye hai." "हाँ, likhi hogi, hamare liye likhi hogi." "Nahi, Baba, tumhara naam hai isme." So it said to Shekhar Pathak and his Pahad. And Pahad is not just mountain. Pahad is the journal he's edited for the last 30 years without any funding, an annual journal on Himalayan ecology, culture, literature, sociology, politics. And he was very cross with me. He said, "Tumne mere naam se kyun likha hai? Tum kisi cricketer ke naam se likhte hai." Right. So, but I'll just tell one last story about Shekhar. To know how friendships, just to go back to a point I made again, and all of you would have had such friendships in your life. How a friendship across with someone who's actually culturally and socially very different from you. In this case, of course, he's a man and a historian, but otherwise, so different. I mean, I'm an archive rat. He's traveled in every village in the Himalaya. And I once went to Ecuador for a conference. And I wrote to him, "Ki main Ecuador ja raha hoon." And he wrote back one postcard, one line. This is long before, long before email. Andes Parvat ko Himalaya ka pranam. You know, so I think this book, I mean, like most of what I've written, you know, obviously it's based on research in the archives, finding stuff, intellectual curiosity, but it's also inspired, influenced, made possible by friendships like this, you know. And I'm glad you mentioned these two, because I think Juan and Shekhar, one in some other country, and Shekhar now, you know, a million miles away in Nainital. But please, I'm sure quite a few of you love the Himalaya, have gone there. Just Shekhar Pathak, Himalaya. Also read his book, which Supriya mentioned, which is a magisterial history of the Chipko movement, which got the Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay Award a year or two ago. And yes, I mean, thank you for mentioning these two people, because they've been you know, I mean,
well, thank you for bringing them closer to your readers.
Yeah, yeah.
And hopefully that also helps, you know, close off the question I started with about your relationship with the Himalayas on a note of love rather than that of bitterness.
Well, it is very dismaying. For example, what is happening with the Char Dham project, the brutalization of the environment,
yes.
I mean, the lack of concern. I mean, and Shekhar Pathak has a beautiful line on this. He says, what we should be doing is making tourism like pilgrimage, instead of which we're making pilgrimage like tourism. So my hometown, Dehradun,
yes.
You know, there's a writer who lives in my hometown in Dehradun, and I shall not mention his name, but he's a very fine, good writer. I mean, in such times, one does not want to get people into trouble for what they tell me.
Yes.
I said, "Kaise, what's happening in Dehradun?" He said, "Kya karu main? May, June mein to mujhe neend bilkul nahi aati." Maine, "Kyun?" He said, "I don't sleep in May and June." He said, "A helicopter takes off from the Dehradun airport over his house to go to Kedarnath, carrying pilgrims from, you know, just affluent pilgrims from different parts of India. And, you know, you could go by road, you could take a car, you could take a bus. In the old days, you could walk, maybe you don't have time to walk." So I think the destruction of the Himalaya through the highway project, the utterly conceived Char Dham highway project, now they want to build a railway line. The dams, the last place you used to have big dams is an ecologically fragile place like the Himalaya. So it is, I mean, it's wounding for me. I mean, I don't know how Shekhar feels. I mean, I mean, these are things that one should really, again, it brings us back to what you said earlier on, Supriya. You know, what we will bequeath to our future generations. Why is it that young people don't want to have kids? And now you know some of the reasons.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry to be so depressing, but that's how it is.
It's,
but by the way, I still dream about Dehradun and the Himalaya. And I wrote a column a few weeks ago, which a few of you may have read, about Kumar Gandharv. It was his birth centenary. And why, among the many gorgeous songs he sung, my favorite is Jamuna Kinare Mera Gaon. Because my home in Dehradun was on top of a hill. Below the hill was a river called the Tons, which flew into the Asan, which flew into the Jamuna. So I like to think Jamuna Kinare Mera Gaon. Yeah. You know, so I still have those sentiments, but you know, I think the destruction of the Himalaya, you know, under a government that professes to be Hindu-loving, it's like
right.
tragic.
And to be Hindu is to love nature and to live in communion with it, right?
And the Himalaya particularly, what they've done, I mean, it's just, yeah.
That's the idea. I'll come back to the question of what it means to be a good Hindu and love the environment, you know, a bit later. I just want to say it's not depressing. I think for many of us who have the climate crisis on our minds, it helps to focus the, you know, the range of emotions that people may feel, you know, perhaps on a daily basis, from panic to depression and beyond. And, you know, through your work, you've engaged not only with scholars, but not in this book, but with grassroots environmentalists who think about this stuff and who cultivate optimism and resilience nonetheless. We don't hear many of those stories in Speaking with Nature, though, and I wonder what you might have to say. I just want, you know, kind of, how do you think about strains of thought that the framework of the book did not permit you to bring in?
Absolutely. I mean, so this book is actually a pre-climate change book, and it's also a pre-Chipko book. So Chipko started in 1973.
Yes, that's right.
And this book basically ends in the 1970s, and a little bit in the 1980s with Krishnan.
That's right.
But I think what, you know, it would be wonderful, just as we need more works on the history of literature and environmentalism in different Indian languages. I think a really good history of modern Indian environmentalism, Chipko onwards, which would look at, because this is a book of ideas. This is a book about thinking through the environment. It's not about acting against the rapacious and destructive forces that devastate, the basis of human existence. But if you think of a history of Indian environmentalism, it starts with Chipko, goes to the Kerala fisher folk struggle, goes to the early anti-mining protests in Orissa in the 1980s, then comes to Narmada Andolan, then perhaps comes to economic liberalization and the backlash against environmental concerns, then moves on to climate change, and then of course the renewal of some of the anti-mining struggles among Adivasi communities, as in the Asdeo forest in central India, which Chitrangada Chaudhary and others have written about. A history of environmentalism that has activists, so the Chipko activists, the Narmada activists, other less-known grassroots activists, that looks at scientists like Madhav Gadgil, A.K. and Reddy, that looks like organizations like Kalpavriksha, like the Save the Western Ghats movement, like looks at scientific research bodies set up in the 80s and 90s, many of which are I'm proud to say, in my hometown, Bangalore, the Center of Ecological Sciences, ATRI, and so on. I think that would be and also finally looks at the impact on policy and why, tragically, it has been so negligible, which it is linked to the different, strands in our political economy.
That's
so
right.
I think, but certainly, though this book is a pre-Chipko book, in the acknowledgements, it thanks all of them, as many activists and organizers and writers and scholars, scientists and social scientists, who actually, Muni talked about two, Shekhar and Juan, who kind of helped me on this journey. And I think it's there could also be, I've written about 10 people in this book. The people I've not written about. Someone who was a native of Mumbai for much of his life, the ornithologist Salim Ali. Deserves a really good scientific biography. Right. There have been some nice popular books written about him, but a really good scholarly scientific biography of Salim Ali, I think would be fantastic. By the way, I passed today, I was thrilled because we were in the Kalagoda area, Dr. Salim Ali Chowk. Not far from the Bombay Natural History Society.
Yes, that's right. That's the connection.
Far, yeah. But a very interesting man and self-trained. And
like Krishnan, who
like
is
Krishnan.
the,
but also sometimes a great scientist, but sometimes with highly problematic social ideas. So I think these are some of the things that I think there's now a new field of environmental researchers. We went through a period where, and let me make this clear, economic liberalization, which was started in the 1990s, was necessary and important for many reasons. It has had many beneficial effects. It raised growth rates. It made a dent in poverty. It led to a new breed of entrepreneurs who did not come from family backgrounds. But it also led to an abandonment of all checks on environmental sustainability. Yes. And the hostility to people like Mera Bhatkar in the Indian press and the vicious personal attacks that environmentalists have endured ever since.
Yes.
And their environmentalists are not anti-development. They're telling you about a wiser, a more sustainable, a more caring, a more inclusive, and a more permanent kind of development. They're telling you how to relate to your soil, your water, your forests, your air, your cities, your villages, in a way in which you'll have a world to live for, generations to follow. And now, then you have a kind of a period of early 2000s, where there's a kind of environmentalism going underground or feeling defeated or besieged. Right. And with climate change, it's come back. And now there are some first-rate younger scholars who I think will take some of the themes of this book and say, maybe Guha was wrong in this direction. Maybe there's too little about the city. And also say, this is interesting, but it's curious that there's hardly any mention of the motor car, because most of the, thinkers in this book were writing before the motor car became ubiquitous. And one of the consequences of the motor car, because this is one of the unanticipated consequences of technology, which Karl Marx warned about, that technology has unanticipated consequences. Without the motor car, there would be no climate change.
Yes, that's right.
Just as we don't know what the smartphone is going to do to all our minds. Right. Now, so I think they are, I would say that, I would hope that, this book would be read for what it says about the past. But younger scholars would say that this book is really, interesting but incomplete in many ways. And the kind of, the follow-up studies I've talked about could then be taken up?
I should think that there will be a taking forward of your work rather than a direct argument against. Because what you provide, and the framework is very clear. You're writing not about contemporary, it's not a contemporary history of environmentalism. It is about kind of the modern origins of it.
Yeah.
And I think it's not only an intellectual, but also an emotional history. And what you just said about the backlash against environmentalists, I think is something that I hope many people in this room have already internalized. There are probably people in the audience who understand that if we didn't have the motor car, we wouldn't have the coastal road, which has reshaped Bombay forever. We would not have a metro shed in the RA forest, a movement against which, and where there was a perfectly reasonable alternative. The idea was not, let's never have a metro, but that we should move it out of the forest. A movement that perhaps many of you joined. So I think to go back to some of the people whose thinking helped shape our imaginations and therefore helped us construct some of these responses should be useful. I do have more questions to ask you, but Jinal, do I have 5 minutes or no minutes before I go to the audience? Should we go to the audience? Yeah. Let's do it. Let's open it up.
Hi. So I'm Anantata, and you actually preempted one of the primary critiques I had of the book, which is that younger scholars would call it incomplete. But I just wanted to go back to the conversation you were having towards the beginning of the talk, which is this distinction between the red and the green, between like the Marxist movement and the ecological movement. And I just wanted to ask whether it might be more useful to sort of look at them as, movements that go sort of hand in hand without the strict divide. Because as we mentioned towards the end, a lot of the issues, at least in India's past and like now the contemporary future, all the ecological issues are also like more often like very Marxist issues. Like all the people who are at least protesting this goes hand in hand. A lot of the ecological disasters are fundamentally a function of people's class distinctions, and even more so caste distinctions. And eco-socialism has also sort of had a resurgence in the last couple of years. So just wanted to ask your thoughts on reconciling that rift.
So that's a very good question. I'd like to make, one thing should be made clear, that Marxism, or Marxist-Leninism to be more precise, is only one form of socialism. What the Russian Revolution did in 1917 was to submerge, destroy, undermine, decertify all other forms of socialism. Marxist-Leninism, ideologically and intellectually, is about hubris, industrial technological hubris. You read the speeches of Lenin and Marx and Trotsky, and they're all about conquering nature. But there were other forms of socialism. William Morris was a socialist. Decentralized socialism, communitarian socialism, which actually were blended red with green. And, and if you read in the Indian context, again, what the Marxist victory, what the Marxist-Leninist victory did in 1917 was to decertify all other forms of socialism. So even Indian historians, Marxist historians, only write about the Communist Party, CPI, CPM, Naxalites. But if you take the Indian socialists, like Kamala Devi, like Jayaprakash Narayan, like Ram Manohar Lohia, to people much later, like you are Anantamurthy, and in my state, where I live now, Karnataka, you'll see a much deeper understanding of the connection between livelihood and environmental sustainability, between social justice and environmental sustainability. So this is I'd urge you to consider this, that, yes, I mean, equity. A book I wrote with Madhav Gadgil 30 years ago was called Ecology and Equity. So equity is central to environmental sustainability, distributive. But I think this has been the problem, that to use a fashionable Marxist term, Marxism, in its Leninist variant, has hegemonized the discourse on the left. You may understand what I'm saying, but there are many other forms of, left-wing thought. In fact, in that book, Ecology and Equity, Madhav Gadgil and I had a chapter where we defined ourselves as conservative liberal socialists. Because the elements of the conservative tradition, respect for the past, respect for common knowledge of everyday people, not arrogance of scientists. Liberal because freedom, dignity, openness of thought, intellectual debate, and socialism because, you're right. I mean, a profoundly unjust world, which India is becoming more and more. Because I talked a little earlier about why I'm not many aspects of economic liberalization were welcome. But now we are going from creative capitalism to crony capitalism. We are going to a form of oligarchy where a few capitalists close to the present government get a disproportionate share of the benefits, which leads to profound inequality, which studies have shown. So, but this is where I would urge you, that there are many varieties of socialism, and it's a historical accident that the Leninists won in 1917, and that led to this terrible neglect by the left-wing tradition as a whole. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, then they woke up and they said, yes, capitalism destroys nature and so on. But actually, if you look at the writings of, as I said, the Indian socialists, I mean, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who is the real originator and pioneer of the Chipko movement, was deeply inspired by Jayaprakash Narayan, which is why he worked renewing community forests, community water systems, and preventing them from, rapacious exploitation by outsiders. So I think this is, there's a conceptual mistake that people make in identifying socialism with Marxism, and particularly its Leninist variant. And I think that's where, I think it's sometimes, I think that's where I stand. I mean, Marx was a great thinker, but Lenin was a brutal authoritarian, Stalin was worse, and Mao was even worse. And if you read Lenin...
And had devastating impacts on the environment in China.
Exactly, absolutely.
Right.
So I think this is where I think we have to be clear about not allowing Marxists and communists, not saying, just as we should not allow a certain political party to claim to speak for all Hindus. In the same way, I think it's a mistake to think that Marxists are the only people who are the tribune for the poor and the dispossessed.
Just two quick reactions to that. I think there are various categories of thought that, perhaps Marxists are engaging with in more or less interesting ways that could be described as anarchist. And certainly some of Gandhi's thought and the thought of many Gandhians in this book has been described like that. So that's perhaps one thing that's worth thinking about. And, towards the end of the book, it's not a prescriptive book, but some of what Ram writes about, which is just about having to change, the necessity of changing our approach to consumption, may be identifiable to younger leftists as a form of degrowth discourse that I know young communists are very interested in.
Hello, sir. Santosh Ambasta here. So my question is very short. It is, how can the concept of metabolic rift, as introduced by Marx, help us understand the modern environmental degradation? And also, sir, when we talk of proletariat, they are the ones who are worse affected because of environmental degradation.
They are among the worst. They're not necessarily the worst, they're among the worst.
Among the worst.
Yes, that is true. That is true. So, I mean, that's absolutely true. I think that's true. You're absolutely right. In fact, as I said, I mean, environmental degradation of all kinds. And I would not use the word proletariat because that is only a particular class of people in India. And of course, the industrial working class is a small part of the working poor in India, right? So you're absolutely right, which is why I talked about ecology and equity. If you look at air pollution in Delhi, it's a classic example. If you look at the question the lady raised about mining and what mining will do apart from the forest is that it would cause soil erosion, the pollution of water sources, the devastation of fields, which the villagers of Jharkhand, Adivasi and non-Adivasi, will be affected. So absolutely, on that, we are clear that in the Indian context, it is about blending, and this is true of all my work, and in this book most recently, but in the work that going back to the 80s, it is about environmentalism as character of livelihood. It's about environmental sustainability as linked to social justice. It's linked, as linked to political decentralization. So that, I think, again, I would say that those of you who, just consider this question that just as Hindutva is not Hinduism, Marxism is not socialism. Just, I would leave you with this.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you very much for staying with us well into dinner time and book signing time. Asad, over to you.
Thank you, Supriya. It's only fair you asked two men in a red shirt to ask the question, and my name is Lalji, so I should have been asked third. But thank you, Dr. Gua, for this enlightening conversation. I think we could have gone on for another hour, but thank you for being here and sharing all those insights. The author will be signing books outside, so please get your copy and sign them. And Supriya, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions, your in-depth research. You know, this evening wouldn't have been possible without our partners. I have to thank them. Literature Live, Amy, Quasar, Melika, HarperCollins, Akriti, Anand, and Udyan. And lastly, the wonderful teams of the Opera House and Avid Learning. We have many more exciting programs coming up. In fact, on the 20th of December, we have a performance of Kathak meets Jazz with 2 artists coming in from the US. And we have many collaborations planned with HarperCollins and Lit Live next year, starting with on the 16th and the 20th of January. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for braving the traffic and not being at the swearing in and coming here instead. Have a wonderful evening and hope to see you soon. Thank you. Good night.